Hello and good evening and welcome to everybody who has joined for this the second webinar that we are having in this series. Um, um, we have today we are talking about cities and home-based workers, and in continuation of some of the issues that we discussed yesterday. It is my great pleasure to host Bijal Brahmadat, who's the director of Mahila Housing Seva Trust, Ahmedabad, as the chief guest for this webinar. If some of you who attended yesterday's webinar remember that we sort of alluded to the good work that Mahila Housing Seva Trust is doing with informal sector workers. Today is our opportunity to learn more about it. But before that, let me introduce Bijal. Bijal is a civil engineer by training and is a recognized expert in habitat improvement, community development, and housing finance. She oversees the MHT Mahila Housing Seva Trust. MHT stands for Mahila Housing Seva Trust operations at the national level and has experience in conceptualizing, planning, managing, and providing support for slum upgradation programs across India. Bijalben has authored several publication papers on livelihood and habitat, housing finance, and community development. Very welcome, Bijalben.
Thank you so much, Shalini Ben, and hello everyone who has joined the webinar.
So I'm going to start, Bijalben, by giving a sort of an overview of the home-based workers and the issues about home-based workers. And then we will talk to each other, converse about our understanding of the home-based workers and the cities. As we mentioned yesterday, that home-based workers are those workers who produce goods or services from their own home for the market. Often they are confused with domestic workers who work in others' home. Home-based workers work in their own home, and they are not a phenomena of the global south. They are found in countries both rich and poor, and they produce a variety of goods, from high-end goods and services for both domestic as well as global markets. And it could be stitching garments, it could be weaving textiles, it could be incense stick rolling, cigarette rolling, it could be flowers or garlands, food items. So they're found across sectors. They work from home, and they form a significant share of urban employment in some countries, and especially in Asia and in India, including in India. If we look at the numbers, before we start on the numbers, I do want to tell you that the um, capturing the statistics on home-based workers is difficult, because only if the labor force surveys put the question on place of work, because if the question is not included, capturing home-based work is a challenge. And some countries have been able to do it, and Vigo has been working um, a lot with the statistical institutions and with our partners and member-based organization to strengthen statistics on home-based workers. But we have some data, and that shows the large number of home-based workers. And in Asia, we see that they form a significant share of urban employment. But they are also there in Africa as well as in Latin America. So in South Africa, we see 6% of urban employment. In Latin America, in Buenos Aires, we see 3% there. And most of them are informally employed. And in the Indian context, we see that in India, 32% of women home-based workers, of the non-agriculture workers, women non-agriculture workers are home-based workers. 32% of the women non-agriculture workers are home-based workers. Just a little bit on the types of home-based workers. There can be two types of home-based workers, two categories. One is the self-employed, which is people who buy their own raw material and supplies and sell their own finished goods. Usually it is to a local market. and the subcontracted, which is the other category. The subcontractor workers, often referred to as home workers, could be part of a value chain, both national, they can be a part of international value chains in several sectors. Also, the most well known seem to be the garments, but uh, 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 that's not the only sector where they are found. They often don't know who they are producing for, are unaware of the backward or forward links, and are engaged which firm they are producing for, who's outsourcing for them. But the other characteristics which separates them from the self-employed is that they are not buying their own raw material or sell their own finish. They produce on order, they're paid piece rate. But both the two categories, we should understand that both the two categories pay for many of the costs of production, which is workplace. Workplace is their home. So the cost of the workplace, maintenance of the workplace, usage of the workplace is borne by the home-based worker, and of course with it is the utilities, electricity, etc., and equipments, and then of course the transport. They do collect goods and deliver goods. And of course, they also absorb many of the risks of production: delayed or cancelled order, changing fashion, delayed payments, rejected goods, increasing prices of raw material, lack of inadequate supply of raw material. So this is a sort of a background to who the home-based workers are and what their issues are. I also want to say a little bit about the constraints before I come to you, Bijal Ben. And the home-based workers, like other sectors of the informal sector workers, share some of the needs and constraints. Like they do not have adequate economic opportunity, not legal rights. They do not have social protection, health insurance, maternity benefit, and they have little representative voice. But for the home-based workers, they have additional challenges besides this with these that I've mentioned. And that is much of it emerges from the fact that they produce at home, and their home is their site of work, which also gives them a lot of invisibility and isolation. And they remain invisible not just to the market, to the producers that they're producing for, but also for labor activists and for the labor movement. Their work is also undervalued. It's written off, done at home. Large number of them may be women, and what we see is that it's almost written off as housework, or sometimes called a hobby, and the contribution that they make to the family and to the economy is not recognized. For the policymakers, they also tend to overlook the home-based workers because they remain invisible, and so they're not taken into account when policies are being designed or regulations are being put out and services are being provided. They are not covered under labor or employment law, and it is often assumed that wider economic trends such as recession or inflation do not impact the home-based workers. But as we discussed yesterday, this is far from the truth. And I just want to stop here and say that yesterday's webinars videos are available, and so we are not going to repeat much of what we discussed yesterday. So I'll finish by just pointing out one thing, that the average, we have enough evidence and studies to show that the earnings are low, really low. And on top of that, when we're looking at the earnings of the home-based workers and the home workers, we also have to factor in that uh, they are some of the costs of production are going out of their earnings. But the contribution is no less. So they contribute to the city economy, they contribute to their families, they contribute by producing goods which are consumed by a large number of population, and a lot of them by low income groups. They buy raw material, therefore they generate demand, they pay taxes on the supplies that they buy. So on the raw material and equipments that they purchase, And so the contribution is, and it is often not measured. So we have very little data, but we know we have at Vigo, we have some studies where we have been able to document and measure some of the contribution that the households, the home-based workers are making to their household and to the city economy. Uh, Given this kind of a background, Bijalven, I am they are invisible in the city, but they are a large number of them in the city. And I want to ask you what you think and what you have experienced as the key issues vis-a-vis the urban policies that home-based workers face in India.
So, as you said, hello.
Yeah, yes, we can hear you, Bijalben.
Yeah, as you said, Shalini, when they are almost uncounted and invisible. And so, when a city makes policies, there is almost no recognition of the fact that home-based workers are there in abundance and they are using their house as a workplace. So in the city policies, you have slum upgradation programs or you have habitat development programs or say infrastructure programs, but there is no recognition of the fact that that house is not only a house but it is also a workplace. For example, I'll give you an example that we had a very good slum upgrading program in Ahmedabad, which is called the Slum Networking Program. And in the policy, it was mentioned that the program is meant for upgrading people who are residing households which are in the slums. And when we went out, what happened was that these houses had home-based workers and there were micro enterprises happening there. And the big policy question that came to us was that do we consider these as commercial units? And if they are commercial units, this was the question the city posed to us, that if they are commercial units, then this program is only meant for residents of slum settlements and it's not meant for commercial units. So there is a tendency to sort of take them as being commercial, whereas the earnings are mini and micro. So that understanding of the informal work of the home-based work and their recognition as workers. And we could call it a mixed feeling that a slum house is also a workplace is almost absent. That is the first issue. The second issue is that when you go to negotiate with city, authorities, first of all, there are no negotiation platforms. And the issue with when you go to negotiate, you cannot just go as home-based workers in isolation. So I think because the city authorities are used to looking at slum upgradation and habitat development in terms of or by final plots. So I think if you go alone as home-based workers, it doesn't really work. And that recognition is absolutely absent. So I think the challenge to policymakers and to people like us is to be able to spell out that right kind of interface, that right kind of probably expression which would make them understand that these houses are also their workplace. So that additional recognition has to come in, which is absolutely absent. Those are some of the issues. And the fact that access to probably a water connection or an electricity connection would also improve their productivity much more than what it would impact the lives of the other people who do not have access to electricity, because there is an additional element of productivity.
Yeah. Thank you, Bijalben. That was very helpful. And if I may add from a study that Vigo has done across 3 cities in Asia on home-based workers, and we find that several of the issues that you are posing is really reflected in our study findings. And zoning is something that we come across over and over again, where the home-based workers, as you're saying, the tiny, tiny home-based workers pitched against a commercial unit and treated the same treatment is to be given to them, which seems a very unfair sort of deal because the scale is so small, so that's one issue. As you said, the other issue is visibility, and the community level organizing also sometimes happens around the issue of place of habitat and not a place of work, or habitat and work. And from the labor perspective, it's not, they are not recognized, so they sort of remain invisible in both trajectories of organizing the poor people around issues of habitat and housing. But then habitat and housing are really, really critical for them. Our study, the one that I mentioned in 3 cities in Asia, show that the size and quality. And yesterday we had home-based workers amongst us who also told us that small size, which doubles up as a place to live, where she has to stop her work, start her household chores, really hampers her work and her productivity. There is no place to store finished goods. No, they get spoiled. The rainy seasons, which is very, very harsh in our part of the world, adds all kinds of complications. The incense stick rollers cannot roll because it is too damp. The garment workers will get mold on their clothes. So small workplace, no storage, no place to keep their equipments, and then poor quality, leaking roofs, water flooding into their homes, poor quality of housing, have such a debilitating impact on the home-based workers. But aspect of working from home is also about occupational health and safety, and the ergonometrics risks that they face in sitting in a bent position, or sitting down for long hours, and inhaling fumes and working in very, very poor conditions really have an impact on their health. The other very interesting finding, which again you refer to, that we found was that electricity, the erratic and costly electricity, really have an impact on their productivity. Many of the home-based workers said that they cannot work, have to stop work. Sometimes they pay extra for illegal connections. Sometimes they use candles for long hours. They have soot on their eyelashes, and the eyes are spoiled. So, and then sometimes, there was a home-based worker who was interviewed, and she said in Ahmedabad, and she said that because there's very poor electricity, she uses hand sewing machines, which not just reduces her productivity, but is also sort of, because she has to do so much, is so bad for her shoulders and for her health of her muscles around her shoulders and hand. So that is the other issue that I find. And so I want to ask you, Bijal Ben, that when government formulates policy about housing for the poor, as you said, that there's probably no recognition of home as a place of work, but have you been able to sort of address some of these issues in your work with the government, or in your own work outside of the government sphere? Do you have any reflections on the issue of home as a place of work?
I think, in fact, that's what we have been propagating all along in MHT's work, because our tagline is that her housing is her productive asset. And we have had successes, but those successes are, sort of a local level. We haven't been able to, sort of really go national with the policy. For example, in slum upgradation programs, we were able to convince corporation that a home-based work cannot be compared with a commercial unit. And therefore, when your policy says that all slum residents have to be included, cannot be considered as commercially producing, and they should be given access to the infrastructure, and that was successful. Again, in another case, there was a tendency by, because we also did a very big electricity access to electricity program for the slum dwellers with the Ahmedabad Electricity Company, which is a private sector utility. And here again, there was a big tendency to charge commercial rates, say commercial units running in slums, and we were able to use data, some of it which we go had produced and some of it from our own experience, and we were able to convince them that the home-based workers shouldn't be charged at the rate the commercial units were charged. But these efforts have been, largely remained at the city level. So our convincing and our negotiations go on with the city level rather than have a huge national policy impact. And that's the struggle. That recognition at the larger level is, I think, the struggle that we are all facing.
Thank you very much. But even at the local level, these are such excellent examples of interventions. Have you seen impact on the home-based workers' productivity? Have you done anything to measure some of these, the impact of some of these interventions, and what have you found?
So we have actually undertaken a lot of studies before our interventions in terms of reaching them basic infrastructure like water and sanitation. And we have also worked on ventilation issues because their housing is really, stressed with heat because there is no ventilation available in urban slums. And we have designed innovative ventilations. And we found that on an average, their productivity has increased by 1 to 1.5 hours, with access to easy infrastructure like water at doorstep, or probably, having ventilation so that there is more light or more air, and they are not stressed out by the heat. Even by access to electricity connection, that has had a huge, huge impact. On an average, increasing their earnings by almost, 1/4 of a dollar, about around 20 Indian national rupees. And I think their overall drudgery and general well-being improves tremendously due to this kind of interventions. We also had a huge slum relocation program at Ahmedabad where, there were slums on the banks of the Sabarmati River, and they were relocated. And, we found that while in other trades, there were issues of livelihoods because of relocation. By the mere fact that they had got a better house, which was not leaking. It was not designed for the home-based workers, but it was not leaking when the rains arrived. And by merely doing that, I think the home-based workers were the only section whose, income had increased a bit after they were given this housing, although they were relocated. So those were some of the observations through our work that we have come across.
Oh, that was very, very helpful, Bijal Ben. And I heard two very key issues from what you talked about a few minutes back. One is this whole issue of how just mere provision of electricity or a well ventilated, more light, a small change in the design can improve productivity so much. I know you do something called an electricity audit with the home-based workers and slum networks. Can you explain that a little bit to us? How is it done, and how does it help the informal sector workers or slum habitants?
Yeah. So what we do is that what we have observed is that with the poor, and especially in fact with the home-based workers in our work through electricity, we have realized that the poor are not willing to invest in getting these services if the services are not at an affordable rate, especially in the case of electricity, because it's provided by the private sector in Ahmedabad, it's very costly. And what we also observed for the home-based workers was that because though their productivity increased by 1.5 to 2 hours, the kind of wages that they were getting because of this increased productivity were so, because the general wage rate in the home based work sector is very, very less, was so less that they weren't really willing to invest in accessing electricity. So the issue, so the point was that, and the usage, they didn't know how to use it. So because, there was earlier when they had illegal electricity, it was unrestricted usage. And now, though it's a safe electricity option and regular, you get it on time, all 24 hours, but it would mean more money and more usage bills. What we did was we actually started training women as energy auditors, poor women as energy auditors. And we designed a portable watt meter, and they took this portable watt meter and moved from house to house in slums, examining their current usage and then auditing their current usage of energy and then suggesting alternatives. For example, in during the night, they may need the electricity focused only at the point of their work rather than have the entire room, lighted. So, specific things like, have electricity point only focusing on your work, or probably in a toilet, you could use a 5 watt or a 0 watt bulb instead of a 40 watt bulb. So that understanding of usage, how to reduce it, and wattage was actually calculated and shown, and different designs and placements were also shown to people by these energy auditors, and that has had a huge impact because their bills were reduced by on an average $6 a month.
That's quite a lot. Yeah. And so the energy auditors, you said, were women from the same community that were trained.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they would go from home to home doing an energy audit with the household and then convincing them how to save on electricity and how to make it a sort of better ventilated, better place to work. So that's, and you've done, sorry, please go ahead.
Also, that they actually, taught the women about how to use more efficient lighting, even if it was like, for example, using a CFL or a LED bulb vis-a-vis a normal bulb, because that would, use more electricity. So I think they became the, for actually making these houses more energy efficient.
Yes, thank you very much. The other thing that I want to dwell on, which you said, was that for the women home based worker, housing is a productive asset. And we all know how ownership of asset leads to the empowerment of women. But and we have also seen that high rents, they live on high rents in very deplorable conditions, and they so your work with housing finance in trying to create housing assets, can you explain that a little bit to us, and what impact you have seen on the informal sector workers, but also especially on home-based workers or women workers?
So I think, the key to production of more housing in women's name, I think, are two big areas. One is that they have increased access to housing finance. And the other is that, of course, you work through government programs for housing where they are subsidized. And that, and you ensure that these poor women get access to program government or by the private sector. So I think, and still, I would like to say that for any 10 housing, at least, and I'll talk more about India because we are based in India, but any 10 housing that is built in India, I think 6 are done by two probably by 3 by the government, and I think 1 by the private sector that goes to the poor. So I think housing finance is key. And it's also difficult because there is an additional element in your included with housing finance. So if you don't have a legal title, most regulatory bodies would not allow you to give housing finance. to the poor. Again, housing finance is separate from the usual microfinance because it's a capital intensive loan. The amounts are not small. Also be a longer term loan, and those are the key challenges that you have to resolve. That's one. The other also is that the woman would look towards more incremental housing, so they would take a loan once, roof, pay it back. They would also take another loan after that, do their walls, pay it back. So housing finance to an extent is also incremental. What we have done is that apart from the absolute legal title, there are forms of progressive tenure where there is a certain security, mm, or de facto tenure, where while it's not a complete legal title, you understand that those houses will not be evicted, and that you have to work very closely with the urban local bodies and the governments to understand, because they are different in different areas. And you, after developing that very localized knowledge, we have been able to give them housing finance ranging from about I think the average size could be um 200,000 Indian national rupees. I'm sorry, I equivalent. You'll have to spell out. But so, and we have been also been what we have done is that we have also promoted smaller credit cooperatives which are owned by poor women, and then we have also promoted a national level housing finance company, which is actually this is the tenural knowledge that MHT has developed and gives women access to housing finance for the women who are on various kinds of progressive tenure. And of course, this ownership then is created, is a joint ownership in the women's name. And in the government housing programs, we have always advocated for women's right. And so now the policies do have a woman as the first holder if she gets a government house through a government program. But the issue is that, although this is a policy change has been made, it doesn't really necessarily get implemented, because housing is given by bad truth is that all eligibility documents, which are resident proofs or tax proofs, or are all in the male's name. So in practice, to bring the woman as the first holder is a bit difficult, although it's present in the policy. And what we do is we act as watchdogs here and try and get the women and facilitate between the government so that the woman's name comes first into the house.
Thank you. There are several lessons there for us and those who are working on the ground. I think the key here is that there is a policy space there which by through which you can create asset for the women, but implementation is a challenge. And the role of civil society then, therefore, could be of a watchdog as the kind that you play, and ensure that when the assets are created under these government programs, they are in the name of women. So that is a key learning that that any organization which may be working at the grassroots level with the urban poor can take from here straight away. But the housing as an asset and creating housing as an asset, uh, um, the interventions are really laudable, but in the designing of the habitat policy or housing policy, how much of the livelihood issues are taken into fact? And have you or is there any flexibility through which you can change the design to include, say, a small veranda for a women home-based worker, or a little window which will facilitate her working? Is there any such provision in the current schemes that exist? Have you experimented with earlier schemes where you've been able to do this?
We, as I said again, we have been able to experiment at a very, very local level where the urban local body is more in command. So small slum upgradation programs. But where there are national policies on housing, especially, I think the design aspect or the work recognition aspect is almost absent. So I think the livelihood aspect is only included in terms of how far the housing scheme is from their place of livelihood, which actually is about all the other workers except for home-based workers. But not necessarily. I mean, we haven't been able to, and the government is absolutely invisible that there are women and they are economically active and home-based, and they are home-based workers. I think that has been a huge, huge challenge to us.
Okay, but I also want to go back to the fact that you referred to earlier that in a relocation, in a slum relocation, it was the home-based workers who sort of benefited by better housing. But what we have seen in some of our studies, both in India and in other Asian countries, that relocation impacts home-based workers almost as much as the others. And I know you have been a great champion for no relocation and in situ upgradation. And this advocacy, the stand that you have taken, has also been reflected by many of the studies where it is almost always assumed that the home-based worker, if they are relocated and moved to a different location, would have no impact on livelihood. Have you seen that in your work in Gujarat and in other places in India?
Um, Yeah, so the impact on livelihood, of course, temporarily it would be for the fact that you stop your work for a certain time because you are relocated, and it takes you a longer time to get rehabilitated. What we have seen is that certain kinds of, for example, when you say that when they are subcontracted, so meaning when you have a middleman who comes to you and gives you the raw material and collects it, sometimes are not affected. In fact, they benefit if they have a better house which is non-leaking. But a lot of these women's time which they could have spent for home-based work goes in building their identities if they are relocated very far away. So for example, if you are relocated, which means your voting card address has to be changed, your children have to be put into school, you have to your public distribution system cards have to be updated. So a lot of these time goes into rebuilding your identities into the new place. That's how home-based workers initially would get impacted, and then of course home-based workers who are self-employed also may get impacted because of the lack of transport issues, which you already mentioned for a while. So that's, but subcontracted home-based workers tend to get less impacted because there is already, they are a part of the value chain, and they get people can approach them wherever they have been relocated.
Yeah, thank you. But I think it also may vary from area to area because, if they are really outcast, the far end of the city, no subcontractor is going to invest in a transport and go and give them work. And they will not be able to collect work themselves. So what we see in several of our studies and documentations is that many a times the home-based worker spends a lot on transport, and sometimes they cannot even walk, and so the little earnings that they are spending on transport, taking a bus, sharing a cab or whatever, and then sometimes they walk long distances, so the productive time is then going on picking up work, etc. So the eviction issues can also vary, and as you are saying that the self-employed, of course, are affected, but subcontract can also be impacted. And I just wanted to share that with you. But I also wanted to share one thing that we perhaps you have not, because it's not in your mandate, you've not looked at in your work. But we have found in our studies on home-based workers is this whole cost of transport, which is almost always assumed that home-based workers are homebound, but they are not. Home-based workers travel to collect goods, they travel to give back finished orders, they may go to the market to sell their products. And so the transport costs can be very high. And if it is coupled with the fact that there are restrictions on females' movement, then it really becomes a sort of a challenge for the home-based workers to give out finished goods and collect raw material. So it is a particular concern, and the home-based workers, for instance, in Ahmedabad, a study we did said that some of the home-based workers who had been relocated were spending as much as 100 to 125 rupees, which is more than an average day's earning, each time they go to the contractor to deliver finished goods and pick up raw materials. So,
In about the relocation, I want to also bring about one more fact that some of the the home-based workers who were relocated had actually to move through areas which were unpopulated. They were so far flung that to reach the main bus stand or take a transport, they had to move through unpopulated areas, and there was a huge issue of safety for them. And so some of them working also because they had to move through those areas which were not lighted and street lights were not there and unpopulated. So safety was also of concern there.
yes. And it could probably be also of a concern because public transport was very poor or non-existent or erratic. So, so they had to find alternatives. But um, I want to, I'm so happy to hear what you are saying about your work at the grassroots level, because it sort of gels in very well with what Vigo's core demands about home-based workers vis-a-vis cities are. And I do want to say that right over here is that, we have a set of demands that we have developed with our members and like yourself and other groups and organizations of home-based workers. And the core demands for home-based workers, particularly, we ask for is a freedom from forced relocation and zoning restrictions, something that you talked about. So it's not just a question of land tenure, but also scale. Again, something that you explained to us. Then the right to basic infrastructures, water, electricity, sanitation, because home is also the workplace, and the absence of many of these things have an impact on productivity. If you have to stand in long queues and collect water, or if there is the water collecting during monsoons outside your home and you have a little garment stitching unit, nobody is going to come to your unit and give you orders. And then the other ones, we also say that right to good housing, adequate housing, and of course there are several other things that we talk about, which is access to market, fair prices and piece rates, and protection from being subjected to poor quality raw material, cancellation of orders, right to secure and transparent contracts. So, so we have a set of demands, some of which we have been talking about. But I also want to share with you, these are more sort of generic demands, but I want to share with you that, in our work with the home-based workers, largely in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and and now the emerging networks in the network which exists in Eastern Europe and emerging ones in Latin America and Africa. We've been able to bring together organizations of home-based workers and home-based workers themselves. And there was a regional conference of city authorities and home-based workers where there was representation from your organization as well in May 2014, if you remember. And the effort was to highlight how good civic amenities enhance productivity for home-based workers. Similarly, then there was the And this 2014 City Authorities Conference came out with a city declaration, Asian Cities Declaration. And then in 2015, again, an event, a global, first ever global conference of home based workers organized in New Delhi, where both you and I were involved, and where there were 100 home based workers representative and supporters from 24 countries. So, in these two regions, also the key recommendations, if you look at it, both in the Asian 2014 Asian Cities Declaration and 2015 Delhi Declaration, one of the first things that they say is that home as a workplace and slums as site of economic activity must be recognized. Integrate home-based workers and their livelihood activities in local economic development plans. Extend tenure security through in situ regularization and improvement in all existing settlements. Extend basic infrastructure to all homes and settlements, and extend public transport services to all settlements. Many of these things we have been talking about. But there's one thing that you spoke very passionately about, and we were not able to explore it, which is the invisibility in the larger policy arena. And although your work is so exemplary at the local level, you also, I sense some level of frustration in not being able to take these learnings, these innovative ideas to the policy level. What is it that is lacking? What can we do together to be able to take these issues of home-based workers? And we have such great learnings from the grassroots, from micro levels, from islands of good practice, to convert it into a strong policy statement.
I think
Do you have?
still really lack the voice. I mean, we have the data and we have aggregated it very well, but I think we really need to have a huge voice platform. And there, along with that voice platform, there has to be patience and perseverance, I think, which is the inbuilt all our work requires. And I think it's presence at all levels of policy. It's not just the national level, but also the state level and also the local level. I think we have to see that our voice has adequate platforms, that we keep lobbying, and I think it has to be at all levels, and keep collecting more and more data. But the key issue that I think we have to crack is that how much of we spell out, very good at spelling out the fact, this interface of work and development. I think we should be able to in a much better way, because the authorities think only in terms of silos. So either it's a habitat silo or it's a work silo. So I think we need to do much. We need to ensure that much more multidisciplinary policies come around.
Yes, that's a very good recommendation, and I must share with you that at Vigo we have been engaging with global advocacy, and we have been we have contributed to the Habitat 3 process strongly as member of the General Assembly of Partners, and to the new urban agenda which has come out of it. And we hope that our engagement with our partners in the respective countries will continue as this new urban agenda unfolds, and we are able to, of course, for all informal sector workers, but because home-based workers are so invisible, we hope that we will be able to jointly take the voice of home-based workers even as this global new urban agenda unfolds at the country level. Bijalman, so good talking to you, and you have so many learnings for us and so many interventions. I am really thankful for you for finding this time. But before I wind up, we have some questions for people who have registered for this, and let me quickly see if there is anything specific that we need to look at. Uh, there are some questions about home-based workers as workers, recognition of home-based workers, and as part of informal sector workers. I want to say that we've discussed yesterday also and today also, and we've tried to highlight that play home is their workplace, despite their numbers being quite large, and especially in cities, they're being quite large. They seem to be not visible to the policymakers. And Beegelben's interventions at the city level have shown how they can be included. But it also needs a national level and a global level advocacy to bring visibility to this section. We also need data, city level data and national level data, both on their numbers and also on their contribution. We also need some visibility for the subcontract workers who may be part of the value chain, to see where they are, what they're doing, under what conditions, and then have code of conduct, ethics, etc. So there are various pathways to bringing visibility to the home-based workers. One of them is through also, and the most critical one is through organizing and building collective voice. Some of it is evident. Yesterday we saw that there were several organizations of home-based workers who are organizing home-based workers. And we heard about the networks, the HomeNet Thailand, HomeNet South Asia. So there is organizing of home-based workers also, but obviously they remain a lot invisible and isolated. And one of the things that Bijelben talked about was this whole issue of identity. And she talked about a group which had identity and lost it in the process of relocation. But many a times we see that they may not have that identity at all as citizens of the city. They may not have the Aadhaar card or voting card in their name because they may not have the required documents, and then they cannot access many of the government programs. So this identity thing is also identity as a citizen of the city, identity as a worker. I think both of these issues are very critical when we are talking about home-based workers, and some of these can be reflected in the policy if there is a special policy for home-based workers. There are queries and the questions here about policies for home-based workers. Uh, there is no policy for home-based workers currently in India, but and there are very few of the other policies at the city level of whether it is housing, as Vijay was showing, reflect home as a workplace. So that's an area that needs to be addressed. Uh, I've talked about contribution and statistics, um, and the issue about positive impact. Again, Bijelben's interventions have clearly shown that although they were local, they were at the city level, they were at the slum level, the impact of intervention in housing, in urban infrastructure, in electricity, in better water connections, in sanitation, there's a direct link to the productivity, and the link and the in productivity does increase considerably. Good practices, I think much of what Beetelven has said is available on the MHT website, and studies and papers are also there. Interventions are also documented, and also on WeGo website we have some of the case studies, including of some of the work that Beetelven has done. uh, in terms of um, yeah, I think we've covered most of it. And yes, but so the learning for us is that cities' policies and urban programs and urban schemes have an impact on home-based workers, and not just on their living quarters or on their living and habitat, but also on their productivity and on their work. And therefore, it is important to understand it is important for municipal governments to understand and recognize that the working poor, they may be using non-conventional spaces like the street or the dump site or the home as places of work, and but that they are not marginalized in the process of city design and city upgradation, but rather integrated into the city development. Bijalman, last and final comments. Anything that you'd like to add?
I think you had, I mean, thank you first of all. It was a pleasure to, represent in the webinar. But I think you had told me that what do we need to do, to increase the visibility. And I think the organizations like MHT, who, I think the key to this is that organizations like Vigo and organizations like organizations of home-based workers and organizations like MHT, who really need to, and bring in joint voice. Otherwise, so you need the data, you need the work aspect of it, as well as you need the city design and the city, organizing aspect of it to come together and then, bring out the voice, which will be, I think, the most effective way of, improving conditions for home-based workers.
That's wonderful, and what a wonderful note to close on. A joint voice which connects global advocacy to local advocacy and national advocacy so that home based workers, their work and their issues at the city level, visibility is brought to them. Thank you very much, and we're going to close on that. Thank you very much.